The afternoon sun blazed over the Caribbean as two fighter jets tore through the sky at nearly the speed of sound, their twin engines howling like banshees across the water. They descended aggressively, dropping to barely 50 feet above the waves, so low that their jet wash kicked up spray behind them. The pilots pushed their throttles forward, feeling the raw power of their machines vibrating through every rivet and bolt. Target acquired, a lone American destroyer, cutting through international waters like it owned the ocean. This was the moment. This was where Venezuela would draw its line in the sand, or rather, in the sea. The lead pilot's hand hovered near his weapons panel. His heart hammered against his ribcage. He could see the destroyer now, gray steel gleaming in the sunlight, seemingly oblivious to the screaming death machines bearing down on it. 200 knots, 300. The distance collapsed with terrifying speed. Sailors on the deck of the American warship looked up, shielding their eyes, watching as 20 tons of supersonic metal roared directly toward them. Some instinctively ducked. Others stood transfixed, knowing they were witnessing something that could very easily spiral into the first shots of a war nobody wanted, but everyone feared. Then, at the last possible second, the Venezuelan pilots pulled up and banked hard, afterburners igniting in twin explosions of flame that painted contrails across the blue sky like burning scars. The jets screamed overhead, close enough that their shadows crossed the destroyer's deck, close enough that the roar was deafening, close enough to send an unmistakable message. We are here, we see you, and we are not afraid. The footage would be broadcast on Venezuelan television within hours, framed as a heroic act of defiance. Citizens would cheer. Politicians would pound podiums. The military would be praised for its courage. But here's what those cameras never captured. While the Venezuelan pilots were banking away, adrenaline surging, believing they'd just pulled off the military equivalent of a mic drop, something entirely different was happening deep in the belly of that destroyer. In a dimly lit room filled with screens and radar displays, American sailors watched the entire encounter unfold with an almost eerie calm. They had tracked those jets from the moment they lifted off from Venezuelan soil. They knew the aircraft's speed, altitude, bearing, and probable weapons load before the pilots had even reached the coastline. Every radio transmission had been intercepted and logged. Every radar emission had been recorded and analyzed. What looked like aggression from the cockpit actually was an intelligence bonanza from the Combat Information Center. The Venezuelans thought they were demonstrating strength. In reality, they were handing over their entire playbook, revealing capabilities and limitations their adversaries would study and exploit. One sailor, barely looking up from his console, muttered to his shipmate, "Well, that was helpful." No alarm, no panic, just professional curiosity and the cold satisfaction of watching an opponent volunteer information they should have kept secret. The encounter lasted perhaps 90 seconds from approach to departure, but those 90 seconds perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with Venezuela's calculation, everything dangerous about geopolitical theater when one side doesn't fully understand what they're up against. Because this wasn't a fair fight. It was never going to be a fair fight. The technological gap, the capability differential, the sheer imbalance of power was so vast that calling it a confrontation feels almost dishonest. One side was flying museum pieces held together with improvised repairs and desperate hope. The other side was operating a technological marvel specifically engineered to turn encounters exactly like this into one-sided massacres. The real question isn't whether Venezuelans' aging fighters could survive an encounter with a modern American destroyer. The real question is how many seconds they'd last before being erased from existence. Let's rewind this entire scenario and understand not just what happened that day in the Caribbean, but why the outcome was never in doubt from the moment those engines spooled up on the runway. The tensions had been escalating for weeks, each day ratcheting up the pressure another notch. After American forces conducted a precision airstrike in the southern Caribbean that obliterated a speedboat and killed nearly a dozen suspected cartel operatives, Venezuela's government exploded in fury. President Maduro appeared on television, condemning what he called a blatant violation of sovereignty. He promised that Venezuela would defend itself, would not bow, would not be intimidated. Washington, meanwhile, framed the operation as a necessary strike against narco-terrorists threatening regional stability. Two narratives, two interpretations, and between them, a chasm of distrust growing wider by the hour. The American response was swift and unmistakable. Over 4,000 combat troops surged into the region within days. Multiple warships, including the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Jason Dunham, began aggressive patrols in international waters just off Venezuela's coast. The message was crystal clear. Any challenge would be met with overwhelming force. For the Venezuelan military, already struggling under economic collapse and sanctions, sitting on the sidelines wasn't politically viable. Something had to be done to show the world, and more importantly their own population, that they weren't intimidated. So they reached for one of the few cards left in their deck, their handful of supposedly operational F-16 fighting Falcons. Now, calling these aircraft operational requires considerable generosity. Venezuela purchased 24 of these fighters back in the early 1980s, making them the first Latin American nation to field this type. At the time, it represented a quantum leap forward, supersonic jets with sophisticated radar and weapon systems. But that was more than 40 years ago. Since then, American sanctions have systematically choked off the supply of spare parts, maintenance expertise, and software updates that keep modern fighters airworthy. The result is a fleet that exists mostly on paper. Intelligence estimates suggest that only 3 or 4 of these jets can actually fly at any given time, and even those are kept aloft through cannibalization of other airframes and improvised repairs. Reliability is always questionable. Every mission is a gamble.
These aren't the sleek, upgraded Vipers serving with NATO air forces. These are early block F-16As and Bs, frozen in technological time somewhere around the Reagan administration. No stealth characteristics whatsoever, outdated avionics that struggle to process modern threats, data links that can barely talk to other aircraft, let alone integrate with naval vessels. The radar systems inside these cockpits are genuine relics, offering pilots a fuzzy, limited picture that would have been cutting edge in 1980 but is laughably inadequate today. Against other aging fighters, maybe they'd hold their own. Against a modern American destroyer packed with sensors designed specifically to annihilate aircraft, they might as well be throwing stones at an armored tank. But symbols matter in geopolitics, sometimes even more than capabilities. Even if these jets can't realistically threaten a warship, the optics of sending them to intercept an American destroyer sends powerful messages both domestically and internationally. It says Venezuela still has teeth, still possesses a military capable of defending national interests. Whether that's objectively true becomes almost secondary to the image itself. So 2 of these aging Falcons launched, streaked low over the Caribbean, engines screaming, heading straight for the vessel they'd been told represented foreign aggression. From their perspective, it probably felt exhilarating, maybe even heroic. One pilot even lit his afterburner during the pass, leaving a glowing contrail across the sky, a visual exclamation point that would look spectacular on camera. Inside the destroyer, however, the mood was entirely different. Calm, professional, clinical. Because long before those jets were visible to anyone's naked eye, they'd been detected, tracked, classified, and logged by one of the most sophisticated combat systems ever deployed at sea. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer represents the cutting edge of naval warfare, even though the basic design dates back decades. These ships stretch over 500 feet from bow to stern and displace nearly 10,000 tons fully loaded. They're not trying to be stealthy or elegant. They're built to be survivable, with reinforced hulls compartmentalized so catastrophic damage in one section won't cripple the entire vessel. But size and armor are just the beginning. At the heart of every Burke-class destroyer sits the Aegis combat system, a technological marvel representing decades of refinement and billions in investment. It ties together radars, weapons, data links, and communications into one unified network operating at speeds human operators cannot match. The SPY-1 phased array radar can simultaneously track more than 100 separate targets, from high-altitude bombers to sea-skimming cruise missiles barely clearing the wave tops. Newer variants upgrade to the SPY-6,
capable of detecting smaller, stealthier threats at ranges that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. If you're flying toward one of these ships, it sees you long before you see it. In fact, it probably saw you taking off from your airbase. Then there's the sheer firepower. Each destroyer carries approximately 90 vertical launch cells packed with a carefully tailored mix of weapons. SM-2 and SM-6 missiles for long-range intercepts of aircraft, capable of reaching out over 100 miles. Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles for medium-range defense against maneuvering threats. Tomahawk cruise missiles for striking targets hundreds of miles inland. Anti-submarine rockets for hunting submarines. It's a floating arsenal, ready to engage threats in every dimension simultaneously. And if something somehow manages to slip through all those layers, there's a last line of defense that's genuinely terrifying. The Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, nicknamed Sea-Wiz, is essentially a radar-guided Gatling gun that spits out 75 rounds per second of tungsten core ammunition. That's not a typo. 75 rounds every single second, creating a literal wall of metal designed to physically shred incoming missiles or aircraft. Many vessels now supplement this with additional short-range missile launchers, stacking yet another defensive layer. We haven't even discussed the embarked helicopters. MH-60R Seahawks operate from these vessels, hunting submarines, identifying surface threats, and carrying Hellfire missiles to engage targets directly. Together, the ship and its air wing form what military planners call a self-contained combat bubble, a sphere of lethal capability extending dozens of miles in every direction. So when those Venezuelan F-16s made their aggressive approach, they weren't rattling an empty hull. They were probing a warship specifically designed to fight and win against exactly this kind of threat, and far more sophisticated ones besides. The imbalance wasn't just significant, it was absolute. The fundamental problem for Venezuela's fighters comes down to three brutal realities: detection, layered defense, and survivability. Let's examine each one and understand why they make the outcome of any real engagement a foregone conclusion. Detection is everything in modern warfare. Whoever sees first almost always wins, because seeing first means engaging first, dictating the terms of the fight, forcing your opponent to react instead of act. The Jason Dunham's Aegis system provides complete 360-degree coverage, scanning continuously for threats. Its radar is powerful enough to track aircraft well over the horizon, meaning the ship knew those F-16s were coming long before they posed any danger. The pilots flying those Venezuelan fighters, meanwhile, were relying on radar systems designed in the late 1970s. Limited range, limited processing power, and absolutely no ability to hide their own radar signature.
Modern stealth fighters invest enormous resources into reducing their radar cross-section. Venezuela's F-16As don't have that luxury. Every surface, every edge, every external weapon screams their presence to anyone looking with modern sensors. So before the pilots even knew exactly where the destroyer was positioned, the destroyer knew precisely where they were, how fast they were traveling, their altitude, and their heading. The Americans were watching a high-definition movie while the Venezuelans were still trying to find the theater. Layered defense means the destroyer doesn't rely on a single weapon system. Engagement begins at extreme range with SM-6 missiles, sophisticated interceptors capable of destroying aircraft more than 100 miles away. If a threat somehow evades that initial volley, the ship switches to evolved Sea Sparrow missiles at medium range, designed to catch agile targets trying to close the distance. Should anything penetrate that far, the Phalanx system activates automatically, creating that wall of tungsten. Each layer buys time, multiplies defensive options, and forces the attacker to beat multiple overlapping systems. It's not a duel, it's running a gauntlet where every checkpoint is designed to kill you. Survivability is where the imbalance becomes almost absurd. A destroyer is built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Compartmentalized design means flooding or fire in one section can be isolated and controlled. Damage control teams trained endlessly for these scenarios. The ship carries redundant systems, backup power, multiple communication networks. You can blow holes in it and it'll still fight back.
An F-16, by contrast, is a single airframe with one pilot and one engine. One missile hit, one burst of cannon fire, and it ceases to exist. The pilot ejects if they're lucky, dies if they're not. There's no redundancy, no second chance, no recovery. But even this undersells the real advantage. That destroyer doesn't fight alone. It's networked into a task force that includes other destroyers, cruisers, and surveillance aircraft. Intelligence collected by one ship instantly flows to every other asset in the area. If those Venezuelan pilots thought they were facing just the Jason Dunham in isolation, they were catastrophically mistaken. They were facing an entire coordinated fleet, sharing data in real time, eliminating blind spots. And let's not forget the escalatory response that followed. Within 72 hours, 10 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters deployed to Puerto Rico, putting fifth-generation aircraft just hours away from Venezuelan airspace. These aren't aging Cold War relics. These are the most advanced fighters currently operational, capable of penetrating contested airspace without being detected, carrying weapons Venezuela's military has no realistic defense against. The deployment was a clear message. If you want to escalate, we're ready, and you will lose badly. The flyby itself changed nothing about the fundamental strategic balance. Venezuelan state media played the footage endlessly, framing it as proof their military hadn't been cowed. Domestically, it probably worked as intended, but internationally, and especially inside American military circles, it was viewed very differently. Every radar emission from those F-16s, every radio call, every heat signature, every maneuver was captured and analyzed. The Americans now had fresh data on Venezuelan aircraft performance, pilot training, communication protocols, and tactical doctrine. What was supposed to be an intimidating act of defiance became an intelligence gift. The Pentagon publicly called the maneuver highly provocative, and they weren't wrong, not because it actually threatened the destroyer, but because it demonstrated how quickly these situations can spiral out of control. All it takes is one miscalculation, one pilot who pushes too close, one nervous weapons officer who interprets an aggressive turn as the beginning of an attack. Then you've gone from a political standoff to a shooting war, and nobody really wins from there. In the end, this episode perfectly encapsulates the enormous gap between perception and capability in modern military affairs. Venezuela's F-16s looked dangerous, sounded intimidating, and generated dramatic imagery. But when stripped down to the cold mechanics of what would actually happen in genuine combat, they represent no credible threat whatsoever to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. The technological gap is simply too vast, the capabilities too mismatched, the outcome too predetermined. Speed doesn't matter when your opponent sees you coming from beyond the horizon. Bravado doesn't matter when you're flying into a defensive network designed to destroy threats far more sophisticated than your aircraft. National pride doesn't change the fact that one side is operating cutting-edge military technology, backed by the largest defense budget in human history, while the other is trying desperately to keep decades-old equipment airworthy through improvisation and hope. So was the flyby an act of defiance or a dangerous miscalculation? Perhaps it was both. Venezuela made a statement, showed its population it wouldn't be pushed around, and reminded the world it still possessed some military capability. But it also revealed just how limited that capability really is when measured against modern American naval power. The destroyer didn't flinch, didn't alter course, didn't even seem particularly concerned. It simply watched with professional detachment, recorded everything for later analysis, and continued its mission without breaking stride. And somewhere in that calm, utterly unshaken response lies the real story that the cameras never captured. Not the dramatic footage of jets screaming overhead with afterburners blazing, but the quiet, absolute confidence of a crew that knows they hold every conceivable advantage and don't need to prove it to anyone.